On May 2, 1348, officials in the Tuscan city of Pistoia wrote a rule about a bell. During a funeral, the cathedral bells were not to ring. A parish, chapel, or convent could still sound one bell once, and only moderately. The ordinance said another funeral could frighten people who were already sick. Hold on to that word, fear. It will matter again before this story is over. Sickness was moving through the districts around Pistoia. A funeral bell pulled a private death into the street. It told every open window that another household had been reached and made the town measure the approach of death one toll at a time. So Pistoia was not simply making funerals quieter. It was trying to control what the sick could hear, how families gathered, and how far the news of one death could travel. But when a town turns grief into a health regulation, who controls the ritual, who pays when the rule is broken, and whose death is still allowed to be heard? The answer was not the same for every family. The records support a scene like this. A bellkeeper stands inside the cathedral tower with the rope in his hands. Below, a covered coffin enters the street. Relatives follow. Neighbors turn toward the sound they expect, but he does not pull. Across the roofs, a smaller parish bell rings once. The note reaches the tower, fades between the houses, and leaves the great bell silent above him. The rope moves slightly in the open air, but not because of his hand. A bell called people to prayer, drew attention toward the procession, and carried one household's loss beyond its doorway. The family could still bury the dead. What it lost was the public reach of the ritual, and the bell was only the first thing the town tried to control. Funerals moved bodies through narrow streets, brought relatives into the same rooms, and drew mourners toward the house. A family could close its door. It could not control everyone who came when the bell called. The obvious explanation is that plague arrived, panic took over, and frightened officials invented a desperate rule. But Pistoia had been regulating funerals long before 1348. In 1330, the city was already deciding who could join a procession, how much incense and candlelight could be used, how a coffin could be decorated, and how a funeral could be announced. Earlier statutes also pushed foul-smelling work and waste away from crowded streets. The plague did not create a system from nothing. It tightened a system already learning to treat movement, smell, sound, and gathering as things a city could manage. That changes the story. The officials were wrong about the biology of plague, but they were not choosing at random. They could see that funerals moved people, that corpses in decay were dangerous, and that fear changed the behavior of the sick. They turned those observations into rules. The May Ordinance separated the city sounds. The cathedral bells were silent. A smaller church could ring once, moderately. Then it narrowed the funeral itself. A body had to leave the house inside a wooden box with its lid nailed shut. The parish priest reported the death in neighborhood. An officer could watch the burial. Mourners were restricted from returning to the house. Paid lamenters, musicians, and public announcers were pushed out. Sound was reduced. Movement was reduced. Contact was reduced. Then, on June 4th, the language became harder. No bell was to ring at the funeral of any person. If one did, the heirs or closest relatives could face a fine of 25 denarii. The rule had moved from controlling the cathedral to placing the cost of a sound onto the family. But a written rule does not pull a rope, stop a procession, or collect a coin. People do that. The rule came from men chosen by Pistoia's civic council and its standard bearer of justice. Enforcement moved down the chain. The podesta, the captain of the people, and their officers received reports, watched funerals, and punished violations. A priest identified the death in neighborhood. An officer could appear beside the procession. A bellkeeper had to decide whether touching the rope was worth the risk. No single person controlled the system. Each controlled one small action. A priest reported. An officer watched. A bellkeeper waited. A family calculated. And the person holding the rope was not always the person who paid. By June, the fine fell on the heirs or closest relatives. The city attached the punishment to the people already responsible for the burial. A relative stands beside a closed coffin while an officer looks toward the tower. The hand on the rope may belong to someone several streets away, but the cost can still return to the family. The bellkeeper is no longer deciding only whether to honor the dead. He is deciding whether that honor could burden the household. The family must decide which parts of the ritual are worth risking a fine. The city had made grief enforceable by making somebody answer for the sound. but not every family entered that calculation from the same position. This is where the rule stops, looking equal. The May Ordinance restricted the cathedral bells, reduced smaller churches to one moderate toll, limited the procession, and placed funerals under inspection. Then it named people whose families could still arrange whatever funeral honors they wished: knights, doctors of law, judges, physicians. The rule that narrowed an ordinary household's funeral left a wider door open for people whose rank or profession made their deaths publicly important. That does not prove every privileged family used every honor. The ordinance records permission, not what happened beside every grave. But the permission reveals how the town understood sound. A bell was not merely noise, it was recognition. The farther the ringing traveled, the farther a person's name and status traveled beyond the house. A quiet funeral could disappear into one street. A full ritual could make the town stop and notice. Now return to the word the officials used: fear. They said funeral bells could frighten or discourage the sick. But if the sound itself was dangerous, allowing wider honors for certain people created an uncomfortable question. Was the sick person's fear less important when the dead person had higher status? The document does not answer that. It places public health and social rank inside the same rule, then leaves officials to balance them. On June 4th, the revised clause said that no bell should ring at the funeral of any person. That sounds universal. But the surviving text does not clearly explain how every earlier privilege interacted with the new restriction. The archive preserved both commands. It did not preserve every choice beneath the bell tower. A law does not prove obedience. We do not have a complete list of bellkeepers who refused, families who paid, or funerals that ignored the rule. The revision may mean the first restriction was not enough. It may mean officials wanted a simpler command. The document does not let us choose. The archive preserved the rule. It did not preserve the silence. What it preserves is the structure. Ordinary grief was something the town could reduce, inspect, fine, and silence. Honor was something the town could distribute. The bell did not only announce that someone had died, it announced how much public space that death was allowed to occupy. Silencing the bell solved one problem by creating another. First, the death became quieter. Fewer neighbors turned toward the street. A family could carry someone to burial while much of the town continued without knowing whose household had changed. Then the ritual became smaller. Visits, public lament, announcements, and repeated ringing disappeared one piece at a time. Then responsibility moved inward. The town did not need to stand beside every rope. It only needed to make the family fear what the rope might cost. And finally, silence itself became unequal. For one household, fewer bells could mean protection from crowds, noise, and the reminder that death was moving closer. For another, it meant losing the public proof that this person had belonged to the community. The city was trying to protect the living from fear. To do that, it reduced how loudly the dead could be mourned. It did not erase grief. It pushed grief back behind the door. Pistoia's rule was not simply cruel, and it was not simply wise. Its officials were trying to solve a real problem with the tools they had. But control always reaches someone's hands. Here it reached the officer watching the procession, the bellkeeper leaving the rope untouched, and the family deciding how much of its grief could safely become public. That is why Pistoia tried to silence funeral bells. Its officials believed the sound could deepen fear among the sick, and controlling the bell gave them a way to control the funeral around it. We still announce death, faster and more privately, but most messages no longer make an entire neighborhood stop and understand the same loss at the same moment. Nothing terrible happened when that shared sound disappeared. What disappeared with it was one way a community was forced to notice that a household had changed forever. Return to the bellkeeper in the tower. The procession waits below. The rope shifts slightly in the open air. His hand does not pull it. The town became quieter. The grief did not.